prepare to be judged. The crime is life. The sentence is death.
Judge Death origin and backstory explained. The comic book series 2000 AD revolves around a futuristic city named Mega City 1, which basically consists of large parts of North American cities. The futuristic city was created to tackle the problem of a population boom. However, Mega City 1 went into a state of chaos and apocalypse following the Apocalypse War of 2104 AD. 30 years later, in 2134 AD, the city met with its greatest disaster on the Day of Chaos. It lost almost 350 million of its population due to acts of terrorism and anarchy. After this day, the city entered a post-apocalyptic state, resulting in the crash of the city's economy. Since then, the city has been governed by a judge system. In simple terms, almost all police and judicial activities are performed by law enforcers called judges.
Law is not the law. I am the law.
They're the police of the city, as well as the judge, jury, and sometimes the executioners. Since judges are not allowed to start a family of their own, the future judges are clones of the existing judges. While most of them are law-abiding citizens, there are a few who don't follow the law and are dubbed the Dark Judges. One such dark judge was Judge Death, who was also the leader of the Rogues. Born as Sidney Diath, he is the prime antagonist of the comic series and serves as the arch-enemy of Judge Dredd, the most famous judge and the protagonist of the comic strip. Judge Death became a judge in a parallel universe and employed his cruel and sadistic ways, which often involved murdering victims who were too weak to stand up for themselves. Death believes that it is only the living who commit crimes, so there would be no crime if all those living were terminated. That's bloody twisted. His cruelty and murderous instincts leave no stone unturned. He once killed a couple apparently because they wasted his time. While his fellow judges from the parallel world are content to relieve their world of crime, Judge Death wishes to remove crime from all realms, and by extension, remove all living humans. It is often argued that Judge Death could have been a future version of Judge Dredd himself because Judge Dredd was not far behind in his ability to inflict violence on criminals. However, Death and Dredd are different because Dredd follows the law and Death makes his own law. In pop culture, Judge Death held almost equal popularity as Judge Dredd and was the reason why we had Judge Death feature in crossover comics like Batman/Judge Dredd: Judgment on Gotham. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. Deadworld and Dark Judges. The Deadworld is like Dredd's Mega City 1, but more closely resembles 20th century Earth, although it had no lack of high-tech gadgets and weapons. It can definitely be considered a parallel Earth. The inhabitants were far more corrupt, psychopathic, and torturous than Dredd and the other Mega City 1 judges. In fact, their nature and personality reflected in their uniform, which were menacing and had skulls all over their black bodies. The Dark Judges enjoyed more discretionary powers than other judges and could give punishment with any degree of severity without being questioned by any higher authority or law. However, they usually were bound by the meager laws of their realm. While Mega City 1 judges studied in the Academy of Law and learned about morality and righteousness while carrying out their duties, the Deadworld judges studied in law school and learned how to torture without feeling an ounce of remorse. The Deadworld judges later came under the leadership of Judge Death, who usurped the position by wrongful means, killing the chief of Deadworld judges. He and his followers created a gray division that later resolved to kill all humans as life itself was considered the most severe of crimes. This led to friction between Grey Division and other Deadworld judges. However, soon the resistance failed and Sidney and his followers came to be known as the Dark Judges. The other Deadworld judges had to serve them willingly or be subjected to slavery. After the fall of the resistance, all the people of the Deadworld were massacred in a mass genocide. After this, the Dark Judges looked for other realms from which they could remove crime. This is when Judge Death and Judge Dredd come face to face. Son of a serial killer, Judge Death was born as Sidney to a loving mother and twisted father. His father was a dentist but secretly a serial killer. Yes, of course, you cannot be a serial killer if you don't keep it a secret. His father's modus operandi was to invite people into his van where he would torture them before killing them and dump their bodies. Young Sidney developed an early affliction to acts of torture and sadism because his father gave wind to such behavior. He would always comment about how nice people became after they were dead. In a way, he believed that the dead made better people than the living. These words of wisdom became etched into Sidney's heart from an early age. Despite the fact that Sidney one day reported his father's crimes to the Deadworld judges, the damage had been done already. The serial killer was sent to the electric chair and he praised his son, who was the one to flick the switch. Strangely, Sidney's father was happy and kept praising the child for committing the ultimate act of sadism. Young Sidney's childhood had been snatched early and he was molded into a boy who derived pleasure out of cruel acts. He started out small, making the dog fall to its death when he threw a ball out of the window in a game of fetch. Of course, shooting down birds was an act of amusement. However, things got out of control only after Sidney killed 3 of his bullies at school.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
The sadistic torturer joins law enforcement. Sidney and his father began torturing his victims together, and sometimes Sidney himself would bring his father victims. However, at a certain point, Sidney developed an animosity for his father, who was careless and would risk being caught by Deadworld judges. As the judges were closing in on his father, Sidney tipped them off and saved himself from being charged as an accomplice in their crimes. After this, Sidney enrolled himself in law school and got initiated as a trainee judge. In the act of absolute sadism, he offered his services to execute his father, as the act would help restore faith in the Deadworld judges. Sidney's seniors saw this as a win, and they would allow him to do so. At the law school, Sidney continued to murder his fellow students until, in the 6th year, he was given the charge of the civil court for a day. He gave death penalties to all the 27 accused and gained the title of Sidney Death.
Father, I don't want to be a dentist anymore.
Becoming Judge Death. After becoming a street judge, the first thing that Sidney did was to murder his own sister and his mother. He went on with his killing spree and became extremely notorious in the eyes of his colleagues and the general public. It was now that his idea of killing everyone to remove crime started taking shape in his mind and solidifying. As a street judge, he met 2 sisters named Nausea and Phobia. They were undead, insane witches who had an obsession with death, cannibalism, and extreme modes of torture. Nausea was a humanoid witch with a decaying body that had several tentacles protruding out from anywhere and everywhere. Instead of in her head, her eyes were placed at her elbows and right shoulder. With claws for fingers, she had 2 living human heads on her left shoulder. Both she and Phobia were spectral beings with psychic powers and had the ability to darken the sun, just like what happens during an eclipse. Furthermore, Nausea could control the rate of decay and decomposition in a body. On the other hand, Phobia looked like Nausea but had a snout and living heads as earrings. Her elbows and knees were always covered with spiders, while her shoulders kept a large scorpion. Her back was covered by a huge mass of worms, and her arms had snakes wrapped around them. Sidney came across the Sisters of Death during a routine patrolling and fell in love with them because they shared his fascination with death. He indulged with them in cannibalism and finally allowed them to perform a ritual upon him. The ritual made him undead and brought him more power, helping him continue in his objective of annihilation of the living. Soon, other judges joined him and he was nicknamed Judge Death, while his group came to be known as Dark Judges. The other 3 members of his team were Judge Fear, Judge Mortis, and Judge Fire. Mega City 1. The street judges of Deadworld were already a bunch of bumbling psychopaths, and when the Dark Judges took over, they massacred everyone in their world. After they had succeeded in their mission, only the Dark Judges and the Sisters of Death remained, and they were consumed by eternal boredom and insecurity. Fortunately for them, travelers from another dimension arrived on Deadworld and encountered the Dark Judges. These travelers had arrived from Mega City 1. After passing so-called judgment on them, Judge Death arrived in the city of Judge Dredd to dispense his idea of justice and to rid the city of crimes for good. Initially, Cassandra Anderson and Judge Dredd destroyed him and his body, but his soul was put on display at the Hall of Heroes of the Justice Department. The Dark Judges Fire, Mortis, and Fear realized that their leader was in peril. They came to Mega City 1 to rescue him and gave him a new body. With this and his freedom, Judge Death was able to lead the Dark Judges to take lives in their thousands. However, Dredd and Anderson once again saved the day, sending them back to their world. But the Dark Judges hadn't been destroyed. They were to return one day or another. Their moment came when Judge Dredd retired as the chief and Judge Kraken took over. The Sisters of Death influenced Kraken into working for them and releasing Judge Death. Now that the villain was back and had the entire force of the street judges of Mega City 1 at his disposal, he and his team created Necropolis and killed more than 60 million people. By now, Kraken had become the 5th Dark Judge. However, Dredd, Anderson, and a few trainee judges came to the fore to imprison Mortis, Fear, and Fire, and to execute Kraken. However, Judge Death escaped Earth to another dimension through the pits of Cursed Earth. Eventually, Dredd joined forces with Batman and Death was caught.
Glad you could join us. Observe.
Judge Dredd, Dredd vs. Death, the first-person shooter game released in 2005, Judge Dredd, Dredd vs. Death, brought the titular characters to life, but due to the low budget and the sloppy storyline, the game received mixed and negative reviews from critics and fans alike. The story sees the street judges intercept intel about an impending plague in Megacity 1. The judges turn the needle of suspicion in the direction of the Dark Judges, and in particular Judge Death. Later, Judge Death and Dr. Icarus release a virus with the potential of transforming the host into a zombie or a vampire. Naturally, Judge Dredd fights an almost immortal Dr. Icarus and then the Dark Judges. The final battle takes place between Dredd and Death. Death possesses Dr. Icarus's mortal body, but Dredd proves to be more than a match. Finally, Death takes refuge inside Anderson's body. Powers and abilities. Since Judge Death lives inside a possessed corpse, he feels no pain. The only way to really hurt him is through extremely severe blows that sever his arms or through incineration. However, if the possessed body is physically destroyed, he can simply take refuge in another. He was created using dark magic by the Sisters of Death, and hence he himself has become an immortal being. He receives help from others and to prepare himself a new host body. For instance, once Batman's enemy Scarecrow helped him prepare a new host body. As far as physical strength is concerned, lifting people with one hand and tossing them reasonable distances is no big deal for him. However, his real strength lies in manipulation of the mystic and in his mind. He can create illusions and images of himself, and can get into the heads of other people. Of course, he has a particular proclivity for gruesome killing, but his favorite method of sending people to meet their maker is to insert his razor-sharp claws into people's bodies and squeeze their heart until it bursts. He can do this because he could phase through solid physical substances.
Don't be afraid. Dying is good. Dying is easy.
Spooky Judge Death. The 6-episode miniseries Judge Dredd Super Fiend revolves around the exploits and adventures of Sidney, or as we've been calling him, Judge Death. As discussed above, Judges Death and Dredd are not so different in their use of excessive force. The only difference is that they stand on two opposite sides of the coin and could never work for the cause of the other. The miniseries projects Sidney as the otherworldly yet heroic version of Dredd.
Judge Sidney to control.
Having been brought to life through reanimation, Sidney's fans can forgive the horrific things that he does because they could see where his real interests lie. The show begins with the scene where Death kills a victim merely because he would have gotten away committing a crime and avoiding a 5-year sentence. So by killing the victim, he managed to kill the culprit as well. The show doesn't feature any of the other Dark Judges, but it does outline the childhood of Judge Death, aka Sidney Diath. The show begins with Sidney working with his father as an apprentice who removes the teeth of his patients until they don't stop screaming. However, on one fateful night, street judges catch the two red-handed and give chase after the father-son serial killer duo.
Father, I don't want to be a dentist anymore.
The end of the chase causes Sidney to want to become a judge himself, and he does so. He becomes so fascinated by death that he himself elevates the degree of his crimes, so that he can inflict a higher form of punishment on his criminals, or shall we say, victims. Soon Judge Death meets Death herself and becomes her very embodiment.
What?
The show somewhat follows the events of Judge Dredd, Lawman of the Future, in which Judge Death was an otherworldly being but also an incarnation of Judge Dredd himself. And although he died in the line of duty, he came back thanks to his unyielding thirst for dispensing justice. It is very often seen that fans love the characters of Judges Death and Dredd, but not the 2000 AD comics themselves, and Judge Dredd's Super Fiend couldn't be a more accurate proof of this sentiment. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks everyone.